Welcome to the Society of the Arts. Play your part well.
Harsh sunlight glared in Mark's room. Turning away from the light, Mark squeezed his eyes shut and rubbed his temples. Loud cooing doves twittered from a neighbour's tree, and he pressed his hand against his ears, trying to block the noise. His stomach churned, and with a rocking motion, he sat up. Rubbing his sore neck, the taste of blood lingered in his mouth. Mark felt cold and thirsty. With a shiver, he groaned. Vampires were real. Professor Mickelson was a vampire, and he, Mark Delaware, had volunteered to become one of them. Bile rose to his throat. Leaning over, he vomited into a trash can near his bedpost. Even after throwing up, he couldn't shake the sickness off. His nausea was worse than a frat party hangover. He knew this was his fault, and he'd chosen the sickness. He fell back on the bed. The ceiling swirled above him as the room seemed to rock. It was the worst case of vertigo he'd ever had. Charlie heard Mark and rushed into the room with a plastic bucket of water. Charlie wiped Mark's mouth with a wet rag and pushed back the young vampire's hair.
Sorry. Steve, as your new father, should have been here, but he's in bed. He made you drink more blood than he should have last night. We're bringing over donors to help him.
Last night seemed like ages ago. Then, Mark was a normal college student. Now, life was beginning to seem a little surreal. He was actually speaking with a vampire while supposedly changing into one. His ears hurt. Those damn birds wouldn't shut up. A look of confusion crossed Mark's face.
Donors are people who know about us and support us by giving blood.
He tried not to heave. Donors. The word sounded unattached to Mark. So distant. So not human.
I'm shocked you said yes so fast. If we'd known that Mickelson was going to change you so soon, we would have prepared. What am I talking about? You're both impulsive. You'll be a great vampire, and I hope we'll be friends. I know you might hate us right now for forcing you to choose. But once the pain goes away, you'll feel different. You'll see.
Rolling over to his side, he tucked his knees under his stomach and groaned. Charlie brought some medicine to lessen the nausea, but it didn't help. Mark's mouth was sore, and his mouth tasted horrible. Eventually, he pulled himself out of bed, stumbled to the bathroom, and looked at himself in the mirror. He was sickly pale and covered in sweat. His red-rimmed, watery eyes stared back at him. Frowning, Mark stuffed the toothbrush into his mouth to get rid of the bad taste. And whoa! Clanging into the sink, a bloody front tooth fell out of his mouth as the taste of rotten blood followed. Mark spit, then checked out the missing tooth in the mirror. Slowly, he wiggled the opposite one. It quickly popped from his gums. Mark started hollering. This wasn't happening.
It's okay. You're all right.
No. He wasn't okay. He'd lost teeth. He wondered if he'd lose his hair next.
It happens to all of us. Your fangs are descending.
Mark paused at the word fangs. Slowly, he swished water and spit again. He didn't want to be the world's first toothless vampire. With hesitation, Mark looked into the mirror. New little sharp canines peeked out where he'd lost his teeth. As he watched, they slowly descended into place. Mark tugged at them just to see if they were real. He nicked his finger. Gasping in pain, he popped the bloody finger into his mouth.
When this is over, Steve suggested I should teach you how to blend in a crowd. I think it'll be fun. There's a lot of places you and I can go. I look young, but I have more experience than the others. Steve will be a teacher for the really important things.
Wait, you're not the youngest? You look young. Well, Mrs. Violet has to be the oldest.
Oh, I'm glad she didn't hear you say that. No, Violet transformed in the 1950s. Don't be fooled. Even though she looks the oldest, she's actually our youngest member besides you. She knew us since the 1920s, and we all appreciated her eye to catch fake art. She surpassed even President Belmonte in that gift. He is her progenitor, although it took him decades to convince her to be one of us.
Mark couldn't believe Mrs. Violet was the youngest society member. Her personality seemed so uptight compared to the others. He wondered if they'd learned to adjust to the times and she couldn't. Or maybe she wouldn't.
I'm the second oldest. Belmonte transformed me. Our human families die or forget us. It's for the best new vampires cut ties. When you don't age, when the younger generations don't believe that you're related, it's painful when family rejects you. We're the president's family now.
Mark remembered that Charlie mentioned his father was a Dahomey prince. He wondered if Charlie was pushed out of his birthright because his family had forgotten him. It was a sad thought. Other society vampires came in from time to time, but it was mostly Charlie who cared for Mark. Eventually, an exhausted Mickelson took over caring for him and gave Mark an IV of something red. Otherwise, he wasn't allowed to eat. The pattern of heaving, medicine, and drowsiness continued for 3 days. He heard Mickelson's worried voice whisper that it was taking Mark longer than normal to adjust. Mark couldn't wait to feel better, and he wondered if he ever would. His mind was refreshed. Mark's sense of smell was stronger. So was his hearing. Breathing in again, he concentrated on rose perfume mingled with sweat. He heard breathing and a sharp gasp. Mesmerized by the scent and the sound, he walked down the creaky hallway and neared a room at the end of the hall. Somewhere in that room was a familiar presence, as though Mark was emotionally linked with whomever was past the open door. Surprise jolted through him. Mark felt someone else's pleasure on the other end of that doorway somewhere satiated his thirst. It made Mark think about his own dry throat. He'd drunk water, but he was still thirsty. He pushed open the door. Mickelson straddled on his seat. A brunette woman sat in between his lap. She smiled as Mickelson sucked her throat. Mickelson squeezed her tighter as she brushed back her hair from her neck. Mark somehow knew that he enjoyed biting her. Suddenly, his fierce eyes locked into Mark's. Mark wondered if Professor Mickelson could also sense him. Mickelson released the woman, and the scent of blood slammed into Mark. Mickelson hollered.
Get him away from here!
Mark acted on instinct. He sprang at her, pushing past the society. The vampires caught Mark in midair, slamming him against the wooden floor as they dragged him out of the room. He was strong. Stronger and faster than he'd ever felt before, and he was giving the society a fight. Slapping the planks, Mark tried to keep them from pulling, but he was no match for 3 vampires.
Bring him downstairs. We'll feed him there.
They restrained his arms and dragged him to the living room. Mark kicked and screamed, furious that they wouldn't let him go. He wanted to know why they wouldn't share. The society whispered to each other, but Mark couldn't focus on them. He hungrily watched Mickelson's donor as he escorted her away. The only thing Mark focused on was her neck, and the only thing he wanted to do was bite it.
Bloodlust. Child, you'll get over it once you feed.
My dear, you know he can't hear you.
Professor Mickelson entered the room and stared at his new vampire apprentice.
I want blood now!
An animal-like fury ripped from Mark. He seemed ready to attack anyone, including the vampire in front of him. Mickelson tugged Mark's scalp and forced him to look up. Mark could feel his fear. Mickelson was afraid.
Mark, listen. Miss Laura, my donor, could lose her life if you bite her like this. Here, drink this instead. When you drink, only take 10 gulps, no more. Listen to your body. You'll quickly feel satisfied.
He poured him a glass of red liquid. He ripped the cup from Mickelson's hands and began to take big gulps, emptying the glass. Suddenly, Mark's eyes become clear.
I felt her pleasure when you bit her. Why?
As long as we're nearby, a tyro and his progenitor are always emotionally linked. We won't be able to hear each other's thoughts, so don't worry, I won't listen in. My donor felt joy when I bit her. What we sense is their spirit. When we connect with their blood, we're able to feel their emotions.
Now that he wasn't going crazy by the scent of blood, he remembered the serious question he wanted to ask while he transformed into a vampire. Mark wanted an explanation for the emptiness, the hollow rift he felt inside.
Is it true that vampires lose their souls?
Mickelson huffed.
I thought you didn't care about such things.
Child, we aren't the original vampires. We do not know that answer. All of us here transformed from the blood of another. I don't worry about it. You shouldn't either.
If it is true, then if we die, we'll all go to hell, I suppose.
He'll be fine. Mark had everything to gain. His fears were nothing. If he was to live this new life, he knew he had to make the most of it. He'd have to live the best life he could, even if he lived to be 500 years old. After Mark was frozen forever 23, he'd promised himself he would be kind, no matter what his fears were. They would not control him. He wouldn't kill, no matter how strong his bloodlust. Mark sincerely hoped he could keep that promise to himself. The night was crisp when all the society walked outside to Mrs. Violet's backyard. Mark's vampire eyes saw the full moon as a glowing pearl. Its light looked stronger than anything in his human memories. Thousands of stars glistened that clear Colorado night. Mickelson pulled a small red wrapped package from his coat pocket and gave it to his new apprentice.
Open it, Tyro.
What does tyro mean, anyways?
A beginner. It's what we call our apprentices.
The inscription read, "Honor the code. There our secret hides."
Technically, that's the Society's motto. It means to always pretend to be human. Our lives depend on it. This rule has kept the Society safe for hundreds of years.
Thank you.
No thanks are necessary. The Enforcer and I spoke while you were transforming. Since you'll be his trainee, you're not yet an Enforcer. Steve didn't want you to belong to a house, but after we discussed it, we think it's best for new Tyros to join the vampire family. However, this may give us some problems. Other groups will see Mickelson's choice as favoritism, but don't worry about that too much. That will be our concern. Go ahead. It'd be our honor to wear our crest.
Mark slid the ring on his finger. It fit perfectly.
Welcome to the Society of the Arts. Play your part well.
Cheers, clapping and hugs surrounded Mark. Raising the Society of the Arts ring, Mark studied it in the clear moonlight and looked forward to a very interesting life.
You need to learn how to be a proper vampire. I recommend Charlie teaching you, since he has a knack for hunting. But I can teach you as well. Who would you prefer to instruct you?
We'll go with Professor Michelson. Earlier that evening, Mickelson taught Mark how to feed, chose a pedestrian walking downtown, grabbed him as he passed an alleyway, bit him, and returned him dazed, but unharmed. Mark was surprised at how the professor acted like the quick abduction was not a big deal. He wondered how long it'd be until he'd have the same nonchalance. They then walked to the professor's usual lecture hall at St. George's University. Professor Mickelson stood with his arms crossed and leaned back against a black chalkboard. Half of his briefcase contents spilled over the table beside him. Mark crossed his ankle over his knees and squirmed. An analog wall clock ticked with loud clunks. He grew restless. Mark knew the professor could feel his impatience, but his prognathus smugly waited. He planned to give Mark a lecture. On the second row of seats in the middle-sized lecture hall, Mark sat as his only student.
Aren't you going to take notes?
Wonderful. It was going to be a real lecture. Mark grudgingly pulled out the collapsible desk attached to his seat, careful not to touch any gum stuck under it. Next, he fished some paper from his backpack, clicked his pen a few times, and waited. The professor leaned down and pulled a pointer from under the podium. No, this had to be a bad joke. Although his lectures were usually interesting, that was when he taught in an auditorium. In late night hour, Mark was his only student. The tyro prepared himself for a long speech. Voices echoed from the brick corridors. Mark glanced at the hallway. Their teaching theatre door was left open.
Today we're going to discuss vampirism.
With a light screech, the word vampirism was written on the chalkboard. Mark jolted in his seat.
Are we really going to talk about that here? Someone outside could hear this.
Why are you worried? You need tutoring, Tyro. The English department has a whole class on werewolves, and our film department has a class on anime. I don't believe our conversation is any more strange.
He continued writing on the chalkboard. Bits of chalk broke and scattered with each clink against the board. Wiping the board with a grey eraser, a puffs of white chalk dust pooled around the board. Mark breathed some of it in and coughed. Over the next 3 hours, he discussed vampire strategies, how to get a willing donor, how not to be overheated by the sun, the nuances of vampire politics, and social rules. As he pointed with the stick at the board, he wrote more words such as honor, other societies, and pledge. He also scribbled the society's motto on the board: act your part well. There our secret lies. Before long, the board was covered with words describing Mark's new life. A single page became a stack of notes. As the professor stepped back, even he was in awe as he surveyed his work. Rubbing his aching hand, Mark looked up at the professor and saw his pleased expression. He was tired from his lecture, but was happy to see Mark listening.
My professor is a vampire. I'm a vampire! I still can't believe it. Are there any other vampire professors?
While some might act like it with their all-nighters, there's no one else in this university. Even if you're a stubborn tyro, you're still a good student.
I never really thought about that before, Professor. I guess you're my father, too. I mean, progenitor. I haven't seen my real dad in a while.
Is he coming to your graduation?
That's the strange thing. I always thought he would. I wanted him to see me in my cap and gown walk across the stage. Tell me he's proud of me. He can't even do that. He said he'll send me a check.
I know this isn't what you want to hear, but perhaps him not coming is for the best. He'd noticed that you look paler. You don't want too many questions asked. I don't know if it'd make any difference, but I'm proud of you. Not because you choose to become like me. No, I was proud of you before you made that difficult decision. You've been a brilliant and independent man for some time. I've watched how you've tutored my students. You have compassion and curiosity. They're good qualities.
Mickelson glanced at the clock.
I'll tell you what, it's a little sooner than I'd hoped, but how about I show you the reins to hunting?
But I just fed. I feel a little full. Not thirsty.
Not humans. Vampires.
Dumb things on street. So many dumb things on street. Dumb